My beloved child, pause here for a moment, because what you are about to hear was not meant to pass by you unnoticed. There are moments when a message arrives quietly, yet something inside you knows it carries more weight than ordinary words. This is one of those moments. Do not rush away. Do not let the noise around you pull your attention elsewhere just yet, because last night something shifted in the heart of the person connected to you, and what happened may explain emotions, silences, and unanswered questions that have followed you longer than you realize. There was a moment last night when your soulmate could no longer distract themselves from what they had been feeling. The room around them may have looked ordinary. Nothing dramatic needed to happen on the outside. There may have been a dim light, a quiet phone screen, distant sounds beyond a window, or simply the stillness that comes when the world becomes quieter and the mind becomes louder. But inside them, everything they had carefully kept under control began rising at once. Memories returned. Words they never said returned. Moments with you that they had tried to place somewhere far behind them suddenly felt close again. And this is where the story becomes different from what you may expect, because they were not simply thinking about you. Something happened that forced them to look at the connection between you with new eyes. For a long time, they had been telling themselves a story. Perhaps that story was that distance was necessary. Perhaps they believed time would make everything easier. Perhaps they convinced themselves that what they felt could eventually become smaller if they stayed busy enough, remained quiet enough, or allowed enough days to pass. Yet last night, one unexpected moment broke through that carefully constructed explanation. It began with something simple. A memory. Not the obvious memory they usually allow themselves to revisit, but a small one they had almost forgotten. Something about the way you once spoke to them when nobody else understood what they were carrying. Something about the expression on your face during an ordinary moment. Something you said casually that they never told you had stayed with them. The memory came so suddenly that they stopped whatever they were doing. And instead of pushing it away as they usually might, they stayed with it. That is when everything began to unfold. They remembered how different they felt around you. Not perfect. Not always comfortable. Not without confusion. But different. There was a familiarity they struggled to explain, a feeling that beneath every misunderstanding, beneath every pause, beneath every unfinished conversation, something genuine had existed. They realized they had spent so much time analyzing the difficult parts of the connection that they had forgotten to ask themselves one simple question: why did the beautiful parts still feel so alive? That question unsettled them more deeply than they expected. Because if everything between you were truly finished inside their heart, why could one memory still change the atmosphere of an entire night? They tried to dismiss it. They looked away. They reached for another distraction. Yet moments later something else happened. Another reminder appeared. It may have been a song, a name, an old conversation, a photograph, a familiar phrase, or even something completely unrelated that somehow pulled their thoughts directly back to you. Suddenly the coincidence felt too strong to ignore emotionally, even if they could not explain it logically. Their heart began asking questions their pride had avoided. What if I misunderstood them? What if I judged something too quickly? What if they cared more than I realized? What if I walked away from something I was supposed to understand instead of escape? And then came the question that changed the direction of the entire night. What if they are still carrying hurt because of something I never explained? My child, this thought struck them differently. For the first time in a while, they stopped thinking only about what they had felt and began wondering what you had experienced. They began replaying conversations from your perspective. Words that once seemed harmless suddenly sounded different in their memory. Silences they thought would protect both of you suddenly looked like unanswered questions. Moments when they assumed you would understand their intentions suddenly appeared unfair, because they realized they had expected you to understand feelings they never actually expressed. And something softened. Not weakness. Not regret for every decision. But honesty. The kind of honesty that arrives when a person is alone long enough that there is nobody left to impress, nobody to blame, and nowhere for the heart to hide. Last night, your soulmate confronted a truth they had been carefully walking around. They never gave you the complete story. There was something they wanted to say during a certain moment between you, but they stopped themselves. Maybe fear intervened. Maybe timing felt wrong. Maybe they worried that telling you the full truth would expose emotions they were not ready to admit. So instead, they gave you only part of what they felt. And that incomplete truth changed everything afterward. You reacted to what you were given. They reacted to your reaction. Then both of you carried different versions of the same moment. This is why some connections become confusing even when the feelings inside them are genuine. Two hearts can experience the same conversation while walking away with completely different understandings of what happened. Your soulmate saw this clearly last night. And the realization became heavier. They remembered a moment when you seemed distant afterward. At the time, they may have told themselves you did not care enough. They may have assumed you were losing interest, protecting someone else, choosing pride, or simply moving forward without them. But last night they considered something else. Maybe you were hurt. Maybe you were waiting for clarity. Maybe your silence was not rejection. Maybe you were trying to understand why someone who seemed to care could suddenly become so difficult to read. That possibility reached somewhere deep inside them. For a long moment, they sat with it. And then they did something they had avoided doing. They admitted to themselves that they missed you. Not the idea of you. Not merely the comfort of attention. They missed something specific about your presence. The way a conversation with you could make time disappear. The way you noticed details others overlooked. The way you could frustrate them and somehow still remain the person their thoughts returned to afterward. The way your energy stayed with them long after a conversation ended. But this realization was only the beginning. Because what happened next is the part they want to tell you. Last night, someone said something to them. It was not necessarily a dramatic conversation. The other person may not even have understood how deeply their words would land. But a sentence was spoken that touched the exact place your soulmate had been trying not to examine. They were asked a question about happiness. A simple question. Yet your soulmate could not answer immediately. There was a pause. And inside that pause, your face appeared in their mind. They did not expect it. That is what shook them. They realized that whenever they imagined what emotional peace might feel like, some part of that image still carried traces of you. Not because they believed every difficulty could magically disappear, but because they remembered who they had been when they allowed themselves to be open with you. For a moment, they wondered whether they had mistaken emotional intensity for danger when perhaps it was simply vulnerability. That thought opened another door. They began remembering why they pulled away in the first place. And here is what they had not admitted before: part of the distance was not because they felt too little. It was because they felt more than they knew how to handle. You represented uncertainty. You represented the possibility of being truly seen. You represented a future they could not completely control. And for someone who had learned to protect themselves by remaining emotionally prepared for disappointment, that kind of connection felt both beautiful and frightening. So they chose what felt safer. Silence. Distance. Ambiguity. But safety did not bring peace. That became painfully clear last night. They looked at the life around them and realized something important. Avoiding difficult emotions had not erased those emotions. It had only postponed the moment when they would eventually need to face them. And that moment had arrived. They thought about reaching out. Their hand moved toward their phone more than once. They considered typing something simple. "Are you awake?" Then they deleted it. They considered saying, "I need to tell you something." Again, they stopped. Not because they had nothing to say. Because there was suddenly too much. How could they compress everything they understood last night into one message? How could they explain that something inside them had changed without making promises they were still trying to understand? How could they tell you that they had finally seen one of the biggest misunderstandings between you? They feared that the moment they opened the door, every feeling they had been keeping behind it would rush through. So they waited. But then something even more unexpected happened. They came across something connected to you. Perhaps an old message. Perhaps a photo. Perhaps words you once sent that they had read many times before but never fully understood. Last night, those words sounded different. One sentence stood out. A sentence you may not even remember writing. And suddenly, the entire past rearranged itself in their mind. They realized you had tried to tell them something. Not once. More than once. But because they were listening through their own fear at the time, they heard something different from what you were actually saying. This realization brought both tenderness and regret. They whispered something quietly. Your name may have been part of it. Then came the words they never expected themselves to say. I think I understand now. Understand what? That is the question. And heaven is bringing you closer to the answer. They understood that one of the things they believed about you was wrong. Not everything. Not every concern. But one important belief. For a long time, they assumed your feelings had conditions attached to them. They thought you wanted them to behave a certain way before you could truly accept them. They interpreted your boundaries as rejection. They interpreted your disappointment as proof that you wanted someone different. But last night they saw something they had missed. You were not necessarily asking them to become someone else. You may simply have been asking them to be honest. To communicate. To stop leaving you in emotional uncertainty. To show through actions what their heart seemed to communicate in quieter moments. This distinction changed something. They began to understand that love and accountability can exist together. Care does not always mean saying yes. Love does not always mean accepting confusion forever. Sometimes a person draws a boundary precisely because the connection matters too much to allow uncertainty to become normal. And your soulmate finally considered that possibility. That is when they felt the urge to speak with you becoming stronger. But fear remained. They wondered how you would respond. Would you believe them? Would you think the timing was too late? Would you be willing to hear the explanation? Would you assume they were returning only because something else had gone wrong? Would you still recognize the person beneath all the silence? These questions kept them awake longer than expected. Yet something changed with every passing hour. Fear began losing ground to truth. For the first time, they considered that they could not control your response, but they could control whether they finally spoke honestly. And this is the real shift heaven wants you to notice. They stopped asking, "How do I make sure this goes perfectly?" And began asking, "How do I make sure I finally tell the truth?" There is power in that difference. Because perfection waits forever. Truth eventually speaks. Your soulmate knows there is something you deserve to understand about last night and about the past that led to it. They want to tell you why they became distant at a moment when you expected them to come closer. They want to explain what was happening around them that you never saw. They want to tell you about a fear they disguised as indifference. And more than anything, they want to correct an assumption they allowed you to carry because admitting the truth felt too vulnerable. There was a moment when you probably believed they had chosen something or someone over your connection. But the reality in their heart was more complicated. They were not moving towards something better. They were moving away from something deeper. Those are not the same thing. And last night, they finally recognized the difference. My beloved child, if you have wondered why certain memories still feel unfinished, it may be because emotionally they were never given a complete ending. Some stories do not linger because they are destined to continue exactly as they once were. Sometimes they linger because there is understanding still missing, growth still unfolding, or truth that has not yet been spoken. Your soulmate is standing near that truth now. But there is something else. Something happened after they reached this realization. Late in the night, just when they thought the emotional storm inside them was beginning to settle, they received information they were not expecting. Nothing dangerous. Nothing meant to frighten you. But something significant enough to make them sit upright and look at everything differently. It involved you. Or more precisely, it involved something they had believed about your feelings. Someone may have mentioned you. They may have seen something. They may have discovered a detail through an ordinary conversation. However it arrived, the information challenged a belief they had carried for a long time. And suddenly they realized that while they had been assuming you no longer cared, there may have been moments when you were simply protecting yourself. This affected them deeply. Because now they began connecting pieces from different times. A conversation you had months ago. A moment you became quiet. Something you refused to explain. A choice you made that confused them. A sentence someone else once said about you. Last night, those scattered pieces began forming a picture. Your soulmate realized they had been looking at your actions without understanding the emotions beneath them. And once they understood that, they could no longer view your story the same way. They felt something like grief for lost time. Not because every moment could have been different, but because some of the distance between you might never have been necessary. Imagine realizing that the wall you thought someone built against you was actually a shield they created after being hurt. That is close to what your soulmate experienced. And then came another realization. They had contributed to that hurt. Not intentionally in every case. Not maliciously. But through hesitation, mixed signals, silence, pride, or fear. They finally saw how confusing it must have felt to receive warmth one day and distance the next. To feel chosen emotionally but not clearly. To sense something real without knowing whether it was safe to trust. They saw it. And this time they did not defend themselves internally. They simply let the truth remain. That was perhaps the biggest moment of the night. Because real transformation often begins not when someone feels guilty, but when they stop arguing with what their heart already knows. Your soulmate stopped arguing. They admitted there were things they wished they had done differently. They wished they had explained themselves instead of assuming you would understand. They wished they had asked questions instead of creating conclusions. They wished they had stayed for one more conversation instead of withdrawing. Most of all, they wished they had told you one particular truth before everything became complicated. And that truth concerns the reason they hesitated when the connection started becoming serious. You may have believed they were uncertain about you. But according to what they finally admitted to themselves last night, their uncertainty was not entirely about you. It was about themselves. They were afraid they could not become the person the connection seemed to require them to become. You awakened a version of them that wanted honesty, consistency, and emotional courage. But growth can feel uncomfortable when someone has built an identity around self-protection. You did not simply make them feel loved. You made them feel seen. And being seen means the hidden parts can no longer remain invisible. That is why they pulled away whenever intimacy deepened. They feared you would eventually notice every insecurity they had learned to hide. The irony is that you may already have noticed. And perhaps you cared anyway. Last night, that possibility touched them deeply. They thought, what if I did not have to be perfect? What if I only needed to be real? That question stayed with them. And something inside them relaxed. For the first time in a long while, they imagined talking to you without rehearsing every word. No performance. No mystery. No pretending not to care. Just truth. They imagined saying that they were sorry for the confusion. They imagined telling you what really happened during that period when everything changed. They imagined admitting what they felt when they saw you becoming more distant. They imagined telling you that there were moments they nearly reached out but stopped because they feared rejection. Then they imagined hearing your side. And this is important. Earlier, their fantasies about reconnecting often centered on what they needed to say. Last night, they realized they also wanted to listen. They wanted to know what you experienced. What you misunderstood. What you hoped for. What disappointed you. What you were afraid to say. This is how you know something in their emotional perspective is changing. They are no longer thinking only about being understood. They are becoming curious about understanding you. But do not mistake this message as a command to wait endlessly for another person. Heaven does not ask you to abandon your dignity or pause your entire life while someone decides what they want. Your path still belongs to you. Your peace still matters. Your boundaries still matter. What is changing in their heart does not remove your freedom to decide what is healthy for you. And perhaps that is another reason this revelation is happening now. You have changed too. There was a time when hearing that they missed you might have been enough. Now you need more. Clarity. Consistency. Truth. Actions that match words. Your heart has learned. And somewhere deep inside, your soulmate senses this. They know they cannot return with the same vague energy and expect everything to become what it once was. If they speak, they need to speak differently. If they approach, they need to approach honestly. If they ask for another conversation, they need to be ready to hear answers that may challenge them. Last night, they understood that. And then, near the end of the night, they made a decision. Not a dramatic promise. Not something reckless. A quiet decision. They decided they could not continue pretending that nothing remained unresolved. They decided they would find a way to tell you what happened. But just as they reached that decision, something else surfaced from the past. A detail they had buried. A conversation you never knew happened. Something another person said to them about you during the period when your connection began changing. And when your soulmate remembered those words last night, they suddenly realized that one outside influence may have shaped their decisions far more than they ever admitted. They had trusted an interpretation that might not have been true. They had allowed someone else's opinion to enter a place where only honest communication between the two of you should have existed. Last night, for the first time, they questioned that advice. Then they remembered what you had said during your final serious conversation. The pieces connected. Their face changed. Because they suddenly understood that you may have been trying to warn them about the misunderstanding all along. And that is the part they desperately want to explain. Your soulmate now knows there was one moment when they should have believed you instead of the story forming around you. One moment when a different choice might have changed everything. One moment that explains why last night became so emotionally intense. And as they sat there, finally seeing the truth, they opened your old conversation again. They scrolled slowly until they found the message. The exact message. The one they had misunderstood. They read it once. Then again. Then a third time. And beneath their breath they whispered, "How did I not see this?" But what they noticed in that message was only the beginning, because there was one final detail hidden in those words that changed the meaning of everything that followed. And when your soulmate finally understood what you had really been trying to tell them that night, they realized the person they had blamed for the distance between you was never the person they should have been questioning at all.